we're always receiving people from all over the world. And one of our guests is actually tuning in from London today. So we've got the Pacific Coast, we've got the East Coast, we've got the Central Coast, and we've got, what would you call the UK? It's BST, right?
Right. British Standard Time.
British Standard Time. And we're live on YouTube. All right. Thank you for joining us, World Affairs Council, Corpus Christi. All right. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to some of you who are tuning in from the UK. My name is Armin Babajanian with the World Affairs Council of San Antonio. We have an amazing program today with some wonderful guests who will be talking about the importance of Iran and the upcoming elections, and also U.S. diplomacy with Iran, which is historically been significant and will be for the years to come. We can't do any of what we're doing without your support. So thank you for being a member. If you are a member, if you're interested in being a member, you will see a link in the chat room to find out about those opportunities. Also, if you'd like to make a gift, don't be shy. There is a place for you to make a gift that is significant to you in order to support our programming that we bring to you. And speaking of programming, it looks like we will have our first in-person programming as well as over Zoom in July. So please be sure to sign up, give us your email, or become a member so that we can share that information with you. I also want to give a really big thank you to Katya Mead with the Iran Project. We have collaborated with the Iran Project before, and we are thrilled to once again partner with them. And I know Dr. Suzan Siavashi, who was a moderator at the last program we had with the Iran Project, is also tuning in from Trinity University. So thank you, Dr. Siavashi, for tuning in. I also want to thank our promotional partners, World Affairs Council of South Texas, which is in Corpus Christi. Thank you all for agreeing to be part of this program. World Affairs Council of Austin and Paso del Norte, World Affairs Council in El Paso, Texas. We also have people from the Federal Reserve Bank, former State Senator Weston Martinez, and I mentioned the San Antonio Area Foundation, which does a lot of great work in the community. I'd like to now introduce you to a fellow Bruin from UCLA. We always have to plug that, especially when there are some indirect Trojans in the house. Not looking at you, Dr. Farman Farmayan. But Dr. Rad teaches at UCLA. He's also got his JD from Stanford. He's a cardinal there, and he will be introducing our esteemed panel, Ambassador Shannon, who is kind enough to be on this program and has been to San Antonio before, and also Dr. Roxanne Farmayan, who is tuning in from the UK. I'm looking forward to this. Dr. Rad, please take it away.
Thank you very much for having me, Armin. Thank you to everyone out there joining us. I'm excited to be part of this and to have I think what's going to be a very engaging discussion on topics that could not be more timely. And to have both of our esteemed guests here on the panel, Dr. Farmayan and Ambassador Shannon. So Iran has an election coming up in 9 days, and many people are not calling it an election, but a selection. And the reason for that is because the Iranian government, specifically a group within the government, the Guardian Council, has the power to whittle down candidates and disqualify those they want to. And so the joke going on the streets of Iran right now is that the current frontrunner, the projected winner, who is both a judge and a cleric, Ebrahim Raisi, the joke is that he's not running against 6 other men. He's running against 6 other spellings of his own name. In other words, his election is a fait accompli. And that's what we have to prepare for. So really, this leads to my first question, the first topic I wanted to bring up, and I wanted to present this to Dr. Farman Farman. We've now seen there's reports, polls have indicated that about a third of Iranians have expressed that they will not vote in the elections on June 18th under any circumstances. We've seen apathy, disenchantment, disinterest now projected to be at a record low. So the lowest turnout in the history of the Islamic Republic is expected on June 18th. I'm wondering, how do you explain this disenchantment? How do you explain the apathy this time around versus previous elections? What's going on?
Thank you, Dr. Rod. I think, first of all, one of the things that we always must remember about trying to understand how public opinion works in any country is to realize that it's really fickle. I mean, if you look back in September, over a half of Americans said they would not get a COVID jab, and today over 63% have one in their arms. So in that light of that picture, I think it's important to realize that Iranians are also very complex, and that it is a situation that's extremely unusual in Iran, as it is everywhere in the world. So first of all, yes, it is very much a selection, but I think we're all sort of talking about it because, unlike in many Middle Eastern states, the situation of an election for president in the Iranian setting is not a sham affair, which it is very many other places. In the past, it has been a larger group, and they have represented a larger number of interests, and they've often been quite negative towards each other. And it's actually been a referendum on how well the government has done. And this time around, it's different I would say, for 3 major reasons. One, because of the sanctions that the country is under due to the withdrawal of our administration, of the Trump administration at the time 2 years ago, after the Iran deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that's quite a mouthful, which we often call the JCPOA, after that was signed. And so, first of all, that has really been a body blow for Iran's economy. It hit 2 of its main pillars: its imports and its exports, and its foreign reserves. And those are sort of the main pillars that any country has to rely on, and it has had none of those. So second of all, there's been, of course, the hit of the pandemic of COVID. Iran was the first country to get it after the Far East. They say that it came in on the return of planes that Iran was sending out to Wuhan with PPE and other aid after it was announced to have taken root there. And as a result, it has had to deal with both the sanctions and COVID. And we know that COVID has hit even the best health systems and even the most efficient economies. And that has been a roller coaster all over the world. And luckily for Iran, its health system was not in bad shape. It has a pretty good widespread health system. So actually, in some ways, it has managed quite well. It's had less deaths per 1,000 than, for example, we have here in the UK, which is something to consider an accomplishment under the situation of sanctions. On the other hand, it certainly has not had the economic resources to handle that situation well. And corruption in this government has skyrocketed. And unfortunately, Iran has always had problems with corruption, particularly economic, in its government, no less today than it was under the Shah. And the result is that has become a major campaign issue. And that is one of the reasons why the front runner, Raisi, as Dr. Rudd certainly pointed out, the most likely to win, is possibly slightly in the head, also because he's a big anti-corruption guy. The sanctions, it has to be said, and COVID as well, certainly gave Iran a body blow, not just in its economy, but in its politics. The current president, who was a reformist and a technocrat, Rouhani, and whose cabinet is largely drawn from people that many of whom have Western educations, really pegged their legitimacy on the economic benefits that the sanctions lifting would bring to Iran. And the people of Iran really were jubilant about that. So that when the US withdrew, that was really a foundering of that platform. And it's very likely, therefore, that yes, a conservative will win. But I have to say, you're absolutely right, Dr. Rod, this is a boring set, despite the fact that there are debates, just like there are in the States. We've had two. The presidential set do carpet each other. They are slightly different. There is a moderate, certainly not a reformist, who was head of the central bank. And there's also another called Jalili, who was actually previously a nuclear negotiator and who's very against having the nuclear deal signed. So I think what we're seeing is a period in Iran that's extremely being kept up under wraps. And I would say the main reason, and I finally come to the third reason, is that the supreme leader that you just mentioned, who's really basically he sort of sits above government, has very much the veto power of a monarch, although the position is not hereditary so far. He's very much likely to be replaced during the term of the next president. And so the election of this president carries significant symbolism for how that transition may be managed. And it's very likely that the supreme leader also was a part, or at least a party, in determining this very small list because he's concerned about how that transition will go. That said, the conservatives are pretty supportive generally as part of their platform. It is actually a foreign policy of Iran at the moment to support the nuclear deal. And I think that at the moment we do see that there is a great deal of hope in Iran by certainly the candidates overall that this will go through. This is not necessarily, though, partnered by a similar view among the people. The opinion polls about the nuclear deal are low. They feel as though in some ways they're quite jaded about the nuclear deal. It's something that neither side, actually either we in Washington or in Tehran, feels is able to deliver what we'd really like it to deliver. We in the States certainly feel as though or this has been put forward by a group of lawmakers in Congress, that there should be a constraint on Iran's missiles, that there should be a constraint on its militias. That's not part of the deal. And at the same time, the Iranians don't want the Americans to withdraw again. They feel as though they did their part. They've complied to the letter. They cemented in their machines. They mothballed their centrifuges. The amount of nuclear enriched material dropped like a stone, and still their partners in both the EU and in the West, in Washington, walked away from what was a deal that had been signed under international law. So this overall, I think, has left the people very unsure that the Americans will actually lift sanctions. And I think they're looking east. Even if the sanctions are lifted or the deal goes back in, the US doesn't have the same appeal as it used to. Now China can produce the same stuff, the same technology, the same kind of trade, but not with the same human rights requirements. And that's very likely now going to be where Iran turns. So let's see, it's all going to happen in 9 days, and the nuclear deal is in process, and the two may be linked. And I guess we're just going to have to wait and see.
Thank you for that. That actually segues perfectly to a question I have for Ambassador Shannon. You know better than anyone here, diplomacy is a very delicate and difficult dance sometimes. And what we saw going into the 2015 signing of the JCPOA, you had a furious attempt, an intense period of negotiations over many years, led in the United States by former Secretary John Kerry, to get this deal done. And it was signed 2015, and then we had a change in administration in the United States, a drastic change in US foreign policy interest, and all of a sudden the United States withdrew. We're now entering a period where we're renegotiating again the same deal on the eve of an administrative change in Iran, including members of a possible Raisi cabinet that are hostile to the deal or any real opening with the West, or the United States in particular. So my question for you is, if you're the United States, why bother entering into negotiations now while there is this instability and this transitionary period? What's the benefit of diplomacy of this kind at this stage? Why not wait until after, let's say, the fall, when Raisi takes power in August, assuming he wins?
It's a great question and an important one. But let me start off first by thanking the World Affairs Council of San Antonio for this opportunity. It really is a great platform and an important subject. And I think Roxanne did a wonderful job in laying out the elections that the Iranians will be voting in a very short period of time, and their importance within Iran and outside of Iran. Because although this is a selection of sorts, the reality is that Iranian people do have a voice, and whether they choose to vote for candidates or spoil their ballots or whatever the decision, they will have an opportunity to say something, and say something important. But she also hit something that I think has been missed a lot in the understandings of what's happening inside Iran, which was said to me by the Iranian foreign minister at one point after the Trump administration decided to leave the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, or the Iran nuclear deal. And that is that in many ways, this collapsed the effort to connect Iran to the Western world, and effectively was turning Iran into a Central Asian country, where its focus was going to be on China, Russia, the republics of Central Asia, and then South Asia, obviously, through Afghanistan into Pakistan, India, and beyond. And that would be a significant shift because President Rouhani and his team, in negotiating the JCPOA and in the effort to preserve the JCPOA, really saw Iran's future as being a more successful one if it were connected to Western economies and to Western societies. And it's not that the door has been entirely closed, but I do think that given what is seen as the unreliability of the United States at this moment, that this vision of Iran more closely tied to Central Asia and South Asia and beyond is something we're going to have to think about. And as far as the Biden administration is concerned, and their decision to make re-entering the JCPOA and winning back Iran to full compliance a central piece of their Middle East diplomacy is driven by a couple of factors. First is the very real concern that as Iran moved further and further away from compliance with the JCPOA, that they moved closer and closer to the ability for a very quick breakout to a nuclear weapon, and that was going to create a level of instability in the Middle East and fear and concern that was going to be harmful to U.S. interests over time. And so the idea was effectively to try to put the genie back into the bottle. And they understood that these elections would most probably take place right in the middle of the negotiations. I think there was hope early on that they might be able to do a quick deal ahead of the elections, but now I think it's understood that the elections will sit right in the middle of the negotiations. But it's evident, at least from where I sit, that the messages they're getting from the Iranians is that these negotiations will continue, independent of what happens in the elections. And this is not just a decision made by Rouhani. The supreme leader is involved in this. And so if the Iranians continue to sit at the table, if they extend the deal that they did with the International Atomic Energy Agency on surveillance and verification issues within Iran, it means that they want to set a stage that allows the negotiations to continue. And if that's the case, it means that they want to end sanctions as imposed by the Trump administration and return to a more open global economic environment, which began to take shape after the JCPOA was initially agreed to during the Obama administration, but which had only partly begun to become real because of the slowness and because of compliance costs with opening up Iran to the world economy. And so I think the real issue for the Iranians is if they think there is a good chance in these talks to get to sanctions relief, they will continue them. And so in that sense, I think it from the point of view of the Biden administration, that was the hook, and they're pretty confident that that hook was once set was going to be very hard to get off.
So you're not concerned that if there is a change and well, there's going to be a change in the Iranian leadership at the presidential level, that would alter whatever deal is agreed upon today. You think that it'll remain stable beyond August?
It could, but it's important to understand something. The next president will not make this decision. He will be a factor in the decision, as will other parts of the Iranian kind of political society. But it'll be a decision made by the supreme leader.
To that end, and this question can go to both of you, the world has changed very much since this was last negotiated back in 2015. We've seen several factors. We've seen a resurgent, aggressive Russia with its foreign policy, both causing trouble regionally and beyond. We've seen China assuming a much more defensive posture in light of the last 4 years, especially because of the pandemic. We've also seen the European Union now. The UK has left. And I'm wondering, in light of these geostrategic and these global changes, do the Western parties to this negotiation, the British, the German, the French, and the United States, do they have the leverage that they did? Do they have the impact in these negotiations that they did 5, 6, 7 years ago, especially now with Germany forming closer ties with Russia with regards to fulfilling its own domestic energy needs, and the British and French taking a bit more of a aggressive posture vis-a-vis Russia, having to do with Russian activity in Eastern Europe, in Crimea, and so forth. Does the West have less leverage than it did before?
I'm happy.
Either of you want to?
Happy to start. I think the short answer is no. I think that one of the unintended consequences of the U.S. decision to step away from JCPOA was the inability of the British, the French, and the Germans to bring the U.S. back to the table, and that this harmed them in the eyes of the Iranians, because the Iranians had assumed that the British, French, and the Germans would defend the JCPOA, and not just defend it rhetorically, but to defend its substance. But the inability of our European allies and partners, our NATO allies and partners, to bring the US back to the table in any meaningful way, I think was a real blow to the Iranian negotiators. The good thing, however, is that Russia and China is involved in the deal. And they're all playing a role in the indirect talks that are taking place in Vienna right now. And, you know, a lot of people talk about great power competition in the 21st century. But I would focus on great power cooperation or collaboration. And one of the important aspects of the JCPOA is that it shows clearly that Russia and China can cooperate with the United States and with our European partners and allies if they see it in their interests. And the fact that the Russians and the Chinese are still in the JCPOA, still part of this process, and still helping to move this process along means that the possibility of this kind of cooperation and collaboration is still extant. And I would say that given the kinds of contestation and confrontation we could likely see, later in the 21st century, that this is important and it needs to be protected.
So I'd like to just quickly go back to your first question to Ambassador Shannon and just add two finger to that. From the Iranian analyst's perspective, the Chaturati inside Tehran, if you will, many of them view having, even though most of them are probably in the reformist camp, most of them view having a single party as actually a benefit in this particular case. And the reason for that is because it's been so politicized in Iran, much as it has been in the States. So it has been a ball that's been kicked back and forth, and the reformists and the current president has been severely criticized, and that will simply stop once all of the major members of the government are all in the same party, and in fact closer in viewpoint to the supreme leader. So I completely agree with Ambassador Shannon that the ultimate decision maker is going to be the supreme leader, and we've seen he's on board. He's thrown his weight behind this, so it simply will be a process that continues. But the constant bickering that has accompanied this will probably be reduced enormously. So it will have greater support, I think, as it's hopefully signed, but then as its terms have to be carried out, and the relationship with the International Atomic Energy Association and all the other elements that are involved with this process, the banking and all of that. So I think that's actually to the good. As to leverage, I always wonder what that actually refers to, because on the one hand, as Ambassador Shannon said already, the leverage on the part of the EU, which was very much what the Iranians were thinking would be used to help keep their economic trade going, and certainly clear, if nothing else, aid during the time of the worst impact of the pandemic, when medical help was something that they've sought. They've sought an IMF loan, which has not been agreed to be given to them, and this they feel has been something that has meant that the EU has let them down, which is very much one of the reasons why in Vienna, if I can point out, the EU is running back and forth very much in a messenger position, because they no longer are viewed as having legitimacy by the Iranians. The Russians and the Chinese, on the other hand, are the ones I would say have the most leverage in this case still. I think that the Russians have always, and they've stated quite recently, they've always felt that the nuclear program in Iran was something that it was using purely as leverage, that actually it was never really planning to build a bomb, and they've said that several times. What it wanted to do was to try to push the agreement so that they would be reinstituted as part of the international community, which is exactly what the JCPOA brought it the first time around. And in fact, there were various spin-off agreements that immediately began that brought further regional security after that was signed, which is one of the things I think a great number of people have expressed concern about in the US. For example, the only multilateral agreement on Syria with both the US and Iran at the table under UN auspices was passed as a result of the passage of the JCPOA, of the nuclear deal. So I think it shows that regional security issues can definitely be, part of what this agreement means. And I think Russia sees it in very much in that terms. And I think China simply wants to have a quiet trading opportunity in the Middle East, and it doesn't particularly like conflict, and that's why it's come up with a plan such as the Belt and Road. It's very much a structured, typically Chinese sort of view of how to manage things within a business arrangement, and it really would like to see that continue. So it doesn't want to get involved in the sticky, costly conflicts that both the UK did, or Great Britain did before, and the US has since, once they've gotten involved in the Gulf particularly. They don't want to get involved in the Gulf that way. So I think they're quite supportive of a deal like the JCPOA. And whatever one might think about it, it is first and foremost a verification deal. It means that international inspectors are able to go without any prior appointment and just show up in Iran and see what's going on. It means that they cannot develop nuclear material anymore under the international nose. They've got an inspection, they've got a verification. So nobody needs to trust Iran anymore. That's what the JCPOA gives it. It takes trust out of the equation. And I think that's definitely what the Russians and the Chinese and everybody else around them, the Saudis and everybody else, would really like, is not to have that nuclear program going without verification.
Thank you for that. And the topic of the pandemic has now come up several times, I think, from both of you, and it would, I'd be remiss not to bring that into the broader discussion here. After 9/11, we saw an opportunity for the Iranians to extend what former President Khatami had called the dialogue among civilizations into practice, and in an attempt to use a very tragic moment, a moment of trauma for the United States, to engage in track 2 diplomacy or back channel diplomacy as a means of empathy, helping the United States deal with what had happened. Was there a missed opportunity with regards to COVID diplomacy, let's call it, in the last 12 months, especially, when there was an opportunity, given how much Iran had suffered with the pandemic relative to other states? And as you had mentioned, Dr. Farman, very early on, was there an opportunity the United States missed to maybe reach out and do a bit more to engage indirectly, not through formal diplomatic channels, but through humanitarian and other relief efforts that could have pushed the relationship along further? And that question can go to either of you. Mr. Ambassador.
Sure, I'm happy to start. I mean, we missed opportunities all across the board when it came to the pandemic. And we continue to miss them when it comes to vaccines. We could have played a much more catalytic role through the World Health Organization in fashioning a global response to this pandemic, to COVID-19. But the Trump administration decided to take a different pathway. And the Biden administration has returned to the World Health Organization. It has sought to reactivate those institutions and relationships that we have used in the past to address these kinds of public health threats globally. And some important work has been done. But even still, there has been a political reluctance to really begin to work to strengthen a larger global kind of vaccination effort and program, because so much has been focused on getting Americans vaccinated. And while the politics of that is clear and understandable, I do think that right now we're in a stage, not only in regard to Iran, but also in regard to the world, where the US competitive advantage is our technology, in other words, the vaccines. And secondly, our logistical and organizational capacity. And whatever issues of social cohesion or political confusion that drove our early response to the pandemic, we are now in a state in which our abilities favor us globally. And I do think that this is something that we need to be focusing on. And of course, Iran carries with it a whole lot of emotional and historical baggage that affects how the United States understands it, how the American people understand it, and especially how our Congress understands it. But the reality is, until recently, only about 1% of the Iranian population had been vaccinated. And although I think they're getting close to the point where they're going to be producing their own vaccines with the help of the Chinese and the Russians, the reality is that the vaccination programs are going to be very slow. And so there still is an opportunity to do something if the Biden administration were to choose to do that.
I think Ambassador Shannon has summed it up. I don't have much to add to that.
And thank you for that. One question that's come through from the audience, and one that I had also thought about asking the both of you: the flare-up, the recent conflict between Israel and Hamas underscored still the underlying tensions in the region, separate from the nuclear discussion, separate from the international diplomacy. We know that Iran very much operates in the region, in the Israel-Palestine conflict, using various factions in the Palestinian groups as proxies for their own regional aims, to be disruptors, to be influencers in some way. The question now is, at this time of, again, Iran focusing inward, as many are saying, with regards to stabilizing its own domestic situation, possibly laying the groundwork for a transition to a new supreme leader, what role do you see Iran playing in the Israel-Palestine or the Arab-Israeli conflict in a broader sense in the short term?
Shall I kick in on this one first?
Please.
So I think it's first important to note that Iran, out of those two countries, Iran is not the only one undergoing a change in leadership. That Israel also is in the throes of a much more cataclysmic one, I think, than Iran is undergoing at the moment. And so I think we need to understand the conflict with Hamas, possibly in terms of a larger process that's being progressed through Israeli politics. And as my role on this is very much that I think look at some of what's going on inside Iran. I think there's no question, first of all, that Iran is a supporter of Hamas, and I also have to say that it was an interesting example of the newer strategy that Iran has. It no longer ships out the missiles and other war material that the various associates that it has around the region need at any given moment. It's actually sharing through knowledge exchange, through technology sharing, and obviously some degree of long-term exchange of trade. All of the equipment that these groups need to make their own. So what we see coming out of Hamas in those many rockets were not suddenly just shipped for a specific conflict, but is something that represents a much deeper commitment to the Palestinians in the way that the Iranians view their leadership there. But I think what's also important to see is that Iran itself has been under a great deal of provocation that has been put at Israel's door. Certainly, Israel has made it very clear that it plans to attack Iran should the JCPOA go through it. In fact, even Netanyahu has said recently that he would get into a war with Iran, even at the cost of the relationship between Israel and Washington. And we might be able to see that in terms of his greater concern about holding on to power than in terms of really the relationship between Israel and Iran, because it seems that his possible successor has rode back on that kind of engagement. But at the same time, what we're seeing at the moment is that Iran has suffered a series of explosions. Just over the last week, there have been the explosions tend to be in their shipping, in their electrical grids, in their nuclear plants. It's often through some kind of major cyber facilitated disruption or possible sabotage. And so I think it is feeling as though it is trying to convey, despite what is an incredibly costly, low grade, but very nonetheless visually impressive series of attacks, including, of course, the 2 assassinations of one of its scientists and one of its generals this last year and a half, that it is trying to not be provoked, that it is not retaliating. And I think that for the United States is possibly one of its greatest stressors in the process of these negotiations, is to keep the relationship between Israel and Iran at a relatively low enough tenor that it doesn't break out into a regional war before that deal is signed.
I think that's a great kind of overview of what Iran's interests in this instance in Gaza and working with Hamas are, and what drives them and how they attempt to manage their diplomacy. I think that it's kind of worth noting that an Iranian official told me at one point that with a new commitment to the JCPOA, any number of agreements are possible. But without a new commitment to the JCPOA, nothing is possible. And I think the Biden administration understands this. And I think many of the players in the region understand it also. And therefore, I think the approach or process will be to try to come to a conclusion on the JCPOA that satisfies both the United States and Iran, and then to use that as a platform from which to address a variety of other issues, from security in the Persian Gulf to you name it. And I think in this regard, as many in the Congress have made clear, and Senator Menendez and Senator Lindsey Graham recently published an op-ed in the Washington Post about this, they want a more expansive engagement with Iran on security issues, not just nuclear issues.
There is a question that came in, piggybacking off of this topic. It's asking, would Iran see the recent Israeli assertion that they, being Israel, would risk friction with the US if that's what it takes to confront the JCPOA? Would Iran see this as a real enough opportunity to prolong the talks beyond a deal in October? And this question says it reminds them of waiting out of Carter to release the hostages in 1980, 79, 80. So again, the question is, does Iran see the Israeli assertion or the threat to risk friction with the US a real enough opportunity to prolong the talks further, to wait out, rather than urgently engage in them and try to complete something now?
I think Iran's primary objective in the talks is not internal Israeli politics. It is addressing the issue of sanctions. And I don't think they believe they have enough insight into internal Israeli politics to try to play or manipulate those politics, based on the talks they're having in Vienna. I mean, they're quite prepared to take, whatever confusion or consternation is generated by them and try to use it to their own advantage. But I think the primary purpose for the talks is to get sanctions reliefs, and they need that sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I would agree.
I think it's also worth pointing out for those of us joining us that the Israeli government, or at least the new one, it's a coalition that is extremely fragile, unlike any I think has been seen there before, with a coalition of both very far right-wing groups as well as Islamist groups for the first time, trying to barely sort of hold on to this. So it'll be interesting to see. I think, as Dr. Fahmian mentioned, it's very cataclysmic in that sense. Israel has never seen a government like this before domestically, and whether or not it can endure, and whether it even endures through the end of the year when a new Iranian president comes into power, would be something to keep in mind. Do you all think, either of you think that the fragility of this coalition has any impact on anything that might happen with regards to a future conflict in the short term with Iran, either acting out through Hamas or any of its other proxy agents?
I think that Iran sees at the moment that it is the instigator of conflict in with Israel, or indeed with most of the other states in the region. It's in talks with Saudi Arabia, for example, and has been for almost a year. They're gaining traction. I think they're both quite focused on trying to resolve the Yemen war first. And I think there has certainly been a sense in the way that Iran has handled this year of provocation that it is no longer a young government such as those that were waiting out the Carter situation of the hostages. It's been around for 45 years. It's a pragmatic government, and it's weathered a lot. And I think it understands that its number one priority is, I agree with absolutely with Ambassador Shannon, that the lifting of sanctions has got to happen for it to be able to start not only jump-starting its own economy in the way it would like to. It is already seeing a change in the economy. After a year and a half, it's finally beginning to gain speed and to start producing, as most economies are the world round that are coming out of COVID, and Iran is no exception, but it's nowhere near as high as it would be, particularly because it's a largely capitalist system. And it very much is reliant on its small business activity, its medium business activity. And I think it's really hoping that that will get jump-started by a deal, trade with the rest of the world, get some of this humanitarian aid, and really be reinstated also as a partner with the US and others in the Gulf to start bringing down the temperature of conflict there, which has not been good for anyone.
Yeah, I would just add to that the Israelis know how to take care of themselves, and they have a national security structure that will continue to function independent of its politics, and that Israeli leaders understand that protecting Israel has to be their priority. And so I would not think that the current fragility of a non-Netanyahu government means that Israel somehow is weaker or less capable of defending itself. And the U.S.-Israel relationship in this regard remains very close and acts, I think, as a real deterrent to any Iranian misbehavior in relationship to Israel.
In regards to sanctions relief, there was a situation in the 90s where the United States and Iran were trying to work out an arrangement where Iran would assist the United States with the release of hostages in Lebanon or in other parts of the Middle East in return for the United States offering a quid pro quo of something back to the Iranians. At the last minute, and this is something that former President Rafsanjani had complained about very vociferously, the United States basically reneged on this quid pro quo deal. And from the United States perspective, the reason was because while Iran engages in diplomacy and positive acts, on the other hand, it is doing bad things. It is engaged in what the United States would claim as acts of terrorism, supporting rogue states or non-state groups in the region. We now have a situation where while the United States is engaged in diplomacy as part of the renewed JCPOA, it is also detaining Australian and French citizens, backpackers, travelers, putting them in prison, denying them any basic due process rights. So the argument is that here is Iran trying to speak the language of diplomacy, but carrying out the acts of aggression or non-diplomacy. How, if you're the United States or the Europeans, how do you reconcile? How do you deal with this so that we don't repeat what we saw in the 90s?
Or what we saw just recently. I mean, when the JCPOA was done in 2015, there was a release of people who had been held hostage inside of Iran. But over time, over the last several years, the Iranians have taken prisoner others. And I mean, currently, aside from French and Australian tourists, there are at least 4 American citizens being held in Iran. And in fact, you know, on the sideline of the Vienna talks, there are talks related to these hostages and to Iranians that the government of Iran insists are being held by the United States or by our allies and partners. And so there is an effort to determine whether or not this can be resolved. It's obviously tricky and concerning because the hostage taking that's being done in Iran is not as clear cut as it could be. because some of it has been done in order for the government of Iran and its negotiators to have chips that it can play in a larger negotiation like the JCPOA. But some of it is done for internal reasons, where groups like the Revolutionary Guard decide that their only way of having a direct voice in the negotiations is to have people that it controls and that only it can release. And this is a complicating factor in the negotiations, because the negotiators have to determine not just who the Iranian government can release, in other words, who the foreign ministry can speak for, but also who the Revolutionary Guard or the intelligence services or conservative clerics are holding or have some kind of final say over. And so it becomes a difficult piece, but it's really something that Iran is going to have to resolve, because a statement made by Secretary Blinken and a variety of his European and Australian colleagues shows clearly that this idea of arbitrary detention and just nabbing people for purposes of negotiation is really not something that can be accepted. And so it's my hope that the negotiations taking place in Vienna will also open a space to resolve this issue.
I have to admit, I have a slightly different perspective on this, although I think you put it extremely well, Ambassador Shannon. I would like to look at 2 points. One is that the prisoners in Iran are being seized by, according to their laws of espionage, of taking photos in areas that are prohibited. And I think one of our needs is to understand that we may not think their laws are valid, and that's certainly our right. But within Iran, those are the laws that they operate under. And it is at our cost not to take them seriously. And I think very often tourists, such as the French tourist that has recently been taken, was found in areas that are clear on the maps as part of regions that are shut off by the military. And I'm from Utah, and I know that vast areas of the Utah desert is area that is fenced off by our American military, and you cannot go there and you cannot take pictures. Now, I'm not saying there's an equivalence, but I think it's useful to look at it from a different perspective and to realize from their perspective, they are following what they consider the law. And I think that they feel it is highly politicized to call these prisoners that they take as hostages. While the other point that I want to make is there always do seem to be prisoners available in France, in the United States, in England, and elsewhere to swap. And the number of those prisoners has actually gone up considerably since the withdrawal of the United States from the JCPOA. And the reason is that a great number of those are being accused of violating American sanctions.
Yeah.
And we may view that as a highly legal thing. But the Iranians don't. They find the whole withdrawal of America from the JCPOA to be illegal under international law. So I just think that we need to understand this within the two frameworks, neither of which are particularly helpful to each other, except for the fact that the JCPOA negotiations is bringing together the two sides. And on the side of that, they are finding ways to negotiate fairly over the lives of people, which is in the end what we need to worry
about. More questions coming through. Is the European Union committed to remaining in lockstep with US policy with regards to diplomacy with Iran, but also with Iran and the broader Middle East? Is this something that we can count on? Or is it possible that we'll see departures from what was a unified position on the key issues?
I think a lot depends on what happens in Vienna. I think a lot depends on what happens with the JCPOA. If the US comes back into the JCPOA, then I think we can find a fairly unified position because the Europeans will work very hard to consolidate the US return. You know, at one point when I was still in government and I was attending the Joint Commission meetings that oversaw the compliance of the JCPOA with our European partners, I had an EU colleague tell me that the JCPOA for them was designed to protect Europe from having a Kim Jong-un in their near neighborhood. Having a country with nuclear weapons and a ballistic missile program capable of hitting Vienna, capable of hitting Paris, capable of hitting Berlin. And therefore, any effort by the United States to weaken the JCPOA would be seen as a hostile act. It was a dramatic statement at the time, and it obviously didn't stop the United States from deciding to remove itself from the JCPOA under the Trump administration. But I don't think the European view of the Iranian nuclear program or their ballistic missile program has changed. And I think they very much want to have the US back in the JCPOA. And if that happens, and if Iran comes back into full compliance, it will be something that I think the Europeans will work very hard to protect in the future.
I would just add a very small addendum to that point, and that is that I think if the JCPOA is not rejoined, then the concern of the Europeans is that there's going to be an arms race in the Gulf, and it won't be just Iran. It will be definitely Saudi Arabia and possibly the UAE, and that is a situation I think that would be a nightmare for any of us, but particularly the EU, which is in their sights.
Thank you both. Armin.
Thank you, Dr. Rad. And I know we're right at the end. I did want to point out, I just saw the question about the youth of Iran. Can you, one of you or both of you could just speak about the influence of Iranian youth in Iran, but also the diaspora as well and its impact on policy in 30 seconds or less?
I'll leave all 30 seconds to Roxanne.
Well, youth around the world is up in arms and marching against, governments, and none of them are very happy with any of them. And I think it's one of the most extraordinary things to be an academic at this point, and certainly watching all of the different ways that the youth is viewing things. I think the Iranian youth feel as though they want economic opportunity, and they're really supportive of the JCPOA going forward, even though they're extremely doubtful that it will happen. So it's a typical type of, double-sided hope. And I think they want hope, and they feel as though they're extremely well trained. The Iranian youth are highly educated, particularly in STEM areas. They're more highly educated. They're turning out more STEM students than even Japan. So they need something to go to. And rather than it being negative in terms of cyber war or nuclear power or whatever, I think what they would like to do is start joining very much a larger economic community and reaping the rewards.
Thank you so much. And we know you all get asked to present your thoughts in many platforms, and we appreciate all of you for taking time, making time to present to the World Affairs Council in San Antonio. Thank you so much for prepping with us, and also for giving us the time from the West Coast to East Coast to the UK. So thank you all for watching. I do want to quickly thank the Iran Project and also our promotional partners, World Affairs Council of South Texas and Corpus Christi, World Affairs Council of Austin, Paso del Norte World Affairs Council, which is located in El Paso, Texas. We appreciate Ambassador Shannon. Thank you so much. Dr. Roxanne Farmayan, appreciate you. And Dr. Rad, you didn't disappoint. I think when you do something good, you're going to be asked to do it again. And so I thank you, and I'm sure the Bruins who are watching, who are also appreciative of the great work. Thank you all so much. If you have any interest in learning more about membership or giving to the World Affairs Council, check out our website, which will be in the chat room shortly. Thank you so much. We'll follow up with a questionnaire if you could take some time to fill that out to make sure that we do our programming well and efficiently. And if you have any questions, of course, you could let us know. Our next program will be in just a few weeks with our book club. And so keep an eye out for that about the borders. And as they say in Farsi, Kheli Mamnoon, which says, thank you very much, appreciate it, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. What a
Best of luck.
pleasure.